Well, as I was preparing for this morning over the past week, I couldn't help but become a little bit thoughtful of my own life. As you start reading of the death of some of these patriarchs, it should kind of instill a little bit of a self-questioning. I remember when I was a young man, and I had a sense that, to use a phrase, the world was my oyster. I couldn't wait to get out on my own, to leave my mom and dad's house, to go to uni, to get my first job, to get my first car. I made a lot of decisions on a whim without really thinking about what those consequences may be. I ran full on to embrace life. It's a time, isn't it, when really life is deceptively simple. You're full of energy and you're excited about the promise of what the future holds. But now I'm in my early 60s. My kids are leaving the house and starting their own their lives around the world. And I can see in them the same youthfulness, the same excitement, the same kind of, I want to get out of the house as I once had. I can see and feel a change, not just in them, but in myself as well. It's a little like what's happened in the last week or two with the fall. You know what? The summer just seemed to keep on going and going and going and never ending. And then all of a sudden, there was that one evening when it just got cool, downright cool. And you knew fall was right around the corner. The leaves would be changing soon. Winter isn't that far away. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm happy for my kids. I want them to get out and to live their own life. I want them to embrace all that God has for them. But I also know that as they become the women of God that He wants them to be, as they grow in maturity and take their place and responsibility in the world, my role diminishes, doesn't it? And so there's a changing of the guard. Their time has come and mine is waning. There's a part of a famous line from Macbeth, and maybe you'll just think I'm silly for putting it in here, but it just kind of struck me. It says, "Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour on the stage, and then is heard no more." Life is fleeting. Now, I'm not trying to be melancholy, but the reality is that is the atmosphere of the verses that we're looking this morning. We are looking at a changeover from one generation of another, because that's what's going on in Genesis 25, verses 1 through 8. We see a change in succession in God's covenant, one generation to another. Abraham, as the main character in God's redemptive history, is now waning. It's coming to an end. And now Isaac, the child of promise, he's grown. He's a man. He now takes center stage. It could even be argued that even since the birth of Isaac, even as a little baby, there was already a transition starting. He would be the one through whom the covenant blessings would eventually go down through the nation. So there's a shift. Abraham, his importance has been winding down. It would have been something, I'm sure, Abraham would have thought about in his later years. And in fact, there's probably one of the things about older age. The older you get, the more time you have to reflect on your life, on the things that have happened. He's getting older. He sees Isaac growing as a young man in stature and in responsibility. I'm not for sure where my clicker is, so we'll have to, there we go. You leave it there for the moment. But again, he's in his last days, and your body starts to wear down. You don't have the energy you have. You think more about what's going on. And the reality is that Adam knew that he had a blessed life, but it was now coming to an end. He had audibly heard God. God spoke to him and said, "Follow me. Wherever I lead, just follow." God had made some very specific promises to Abraham. God had given not just him, but Sarah as well, a child. When they had been barren for decades, God blessed them with a baby boy. God established a covenant with them, and then later actually formalized ratified that covenant by appearing as a fire and passing between two halves of the animals that were there. Abraham knew that he had lived an extraordinary life. He had led armies into battle. He ate with kings. He had cemented treaties between world powers. And he was blessed by Melchizedek, the priest of Salem. God, the creator of all things, the sustainer of life, had condescended to make a covenant with him and his descendants that would follow. And he had been the patriarch of this family of faith for over 100 years at this point. But here's the thing, if God's covenant and all of the blessings were to be embraced by the generations that were still to come, Abraham's time had to end. It was now Isaac's turn to carry the covenant forward. Abraham, as we'll see, was blessed, even in his last moments and his last breath. And so the big idea I want us to take away this morning is this: faith rests in God's faithfulness to the very end. Abraham shows us that a blessed life isn't success according to the world. It's measured by trusting God through his promises in every season of life and enduring to the very end itself. And that should really challenge us. It should challenge us because we need to ask, what does it mean to live a blessed life in the covenant of God today, in a world that offers so much for us? In verse 1, we read that Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. Now, this may sound like a small deal, but it's actually kind of significant. When Sarah had died, Abraham was already really well advanced in years, wasn't he? But because he was still full of life, he remarried, and he's had another 38 years with Keturah. It's kind of funny when you think about it. Here's this man who decades later had kind of laughed and had wondered, can God really give me a child? And now, decades later, he's having 6 more. But remember, what was God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:2? I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And then in Genesis 17:4, what? Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. Okay, so look at verses 2 and 4 that we just read. Whose names do we read? Abraham's sons through Keturah, and their sons, which are Abraham's grandchildren. Maybe when you heard Alyssa say those words so well prepared this morning, all of those names, you thought, okay, so what? Well, you know what? These names tell us something. It tells us that God's promises are continuing to work their way out to Abraham. He is the father of nations. And those promises are being fulfilled before our eyes in his very last days. Each of these sons would become the founder of various tribes, various peoples throughout the Arabian Peninsula. They would go on to control large areas of land and have great influence in the trade that was going on. And some of them would even become enemies of God's people, Israel. Now, despite having 6 more kids, 6 more male children with Keturah, verse 5 tells us something important. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. After all, Isaac was the firstborn. Well, firstborn, real DNA, hereditary with Sarah. Isaac was the male child of promise. He was the miracle baby. He was the child of the covenant. So Isaac gets everything. And as you can imagine, my wife comes from a big family. Mine's not so many. I've got 2 brothers. But you have a lot of brothers and sisters. You can understand when someone passes away how contentious things can get, right? Here, Isaac gets everything. And so it sets up a real possibility in the future that as Abraham dies, that someone at some time is actually going to contest, to some degree, all of the wealth and all of the privileges that went to Isaac. Oh, woe is me, we never got our fair share. But Abraham was actually a very generous man. He was a wise man. Because what he does is he gives gifts to the sons. He gives them camels. He gives them livestock. He gives them money. And then he sends them way to the east, far to the east, well outside the promised land, so that they can make their living and set up homes there in the distant land. Sending them to a faraway place may sound harsh. Think of sending your child and just say, okay, everything goes to the firstborn, and now you have to actually move to Thunder Bay. We don't want you around. But there's a difference here. Abraham wanted to be sure that Isaac's unique position as the covenant heir would never become challenged or put into jeopardy. Abraham also wanted to be sure that the sons of Keturah could never lay claim to any of the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. So when we kind of look at it in that light, Abraham is simply committing himself to God's covenant promises, isn't he? If the land belongs to the God's covenant people, Abraham through Isaac and through Jacob, as we'll see another day, then none of Keturah's sons has any claim there. They can't live there. They are not part of God's covenant people. God had blessed Abraham, even in his old age. He's made Abraham the father of nations. We see that just on these pages. The father of nations, which is exactly what that honorific name that he received several chapters before. Remember, it means father of many nations. For his part, Abraham shows remarkable ongoing commitment and resolve to God, to his promises, to his purposes. He didn't try to reinterpret God's plan in his last days and sneak one by God because he had another son he really liked, or that there could have been a daughter and she was marrying somebody who didn't have anything, so I'm going to make sure they're looked after too. He didn't create his own pathway. He didn't go soft like so many older people do and just start embracing every aspect of life, even if it goes against God's will. He remains faithful to God's revealed purposes. And that's really what should stand out about us about these verses here. Abraham's ongoing faithfulness even in his final days. What are some of the things he does? Well, first, as we've just seen, he provides for Isaac as the covenant heir. Abraham didn't waver in his commitment to God. He even cared for the others, but he knew he had to set up Isaac as that ongoing heir of promise. He remained clear-headed about what God's purpose was, even though there were many others who wanted to share in the wealth. The second thing he does is we see wise management in verse 6, don't we? This great potential in the family to have conflict. Abraham didn't leave a mess for the next generation. He took care of things. He made sure that everything was cleaned up. He made the difficult decisions while he was still alive. sending the other sons of Keturah away with gifts that would help establish them in the future. This wasn't a rejection. This was actually responsible leadership that protected God's covenant ways and purposes. And third, in verse 8, it says, Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Now that phrase, full of years, doesn't just mean he lived a long time. In the Hebrew, the thought is that he lived well. He lived a complete life. He lived a life of satisfaction with God. And that tells us that Abraham didn't cling desperately to life. He didn't have any regrets at the end of his day. He finished his walk of faith well. And then in verse 4, the fourth part is in verses 9 and 10. It says, Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. Think of it. When Isaac was born, Ishmael was ridiculing. We know that he had a heart that was set against Isaac. How that must have festered and grew over the years. But what we read here is somehow, at least for a brief moment, there was some kind of reconciliation that came together as they put their mutual biological father in the grave. And so we can think and look at Abraham's faith as he was the father of several different family groups, as he was trying to undoubtedly speak into the lives spiritually of the young men that he was accountable for. He lived a life of faith and of love that had some kind of healing effect on the two young men that had harbored a grudge for years. And the very fact that it mentions the cave of Machpelah, we're reminded of Abraham's understanding that he is simply a sojourner. He doesn't own anything else but this little plot of land that he got from the Hittites. And what it tells us again is that even as he dies, he's not received the promises that he's yearned for. He's only seeing them from afar. So in all of these ways, Abraham has demonstrated in his very last days, I would say, a remarkable faith that was exemplary of everything that had led up to that point. He didn't retire from following God. He didn't become self-focused or bitter on anything. He remained active in carrying out God's purposes with his very last breath. In verses 12 through 18, we see a shift in the generations to Ishmael. Now, again, you may say, well, why is that included in the scriptures? Well, it's another demonstration, isn't it, of God's faithfulness to his promises. Remember in Genesis 17 and 20, after God tells Abraham he's got to send Hagar and Ishmael away, and God pleads on behalf of them. And this is what God says, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, that is Ishmael, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. And so now here in verses 13 through 16, we see what? We see the names of the 12 sons of Ishmael being described as 12 princes according to their tribes. God kept his promise, not only to Isaac, but also to Ishmael. The Ishmaelites would become established tribes just as God promised. So even the genealogy, as short as it is, and coming what seems to be a strange place here now at the very death of Abraham, has a purpose. Abraham's legacy extends beyond simply the line of promise, the line of the covenant through Isaac. It touches multiple, almost endless peoples and tribes, just as God had promised. But there's a twist here you may not have caught. We know that Ishmael lives to be 137 years old. And what does verse 18 say? He settled over against his kinsmen. I don't know if you can hear it, but in those words, there's the unmistakable echo of hostility, of war. These sons would become the peoples who inhabit the area that we now know as Saudi Arabia and the Arab world. And from this point onwards, they now stand in opposition to God's chosen people, Israel. Something that we see even in the news every day today. And everything we read about regarding Ishmael's sons, it stands really in sharp contrast to Abraham. Abraham lived and died full of years and was gathered unto his people. It's language that talks about and suggests peace and comfort and union with God. And here's what we're supposed to see. There is a difference between being or living a life in covenant with God versus living outside on the periphery of that covenant. There's a difference in saying I am a Christian and I come to church and simply coming to church. There's a difference. So what does it mean? As we look at Abraham's life, what does it mean for us today? Well, many of us, I would hazard a guess, are in probably the years where we have more opportunity of earning. Many of us live comfortable lives, or most of us at least are striving after a comfortable life. But Abraham's example is something different. It should be a profound challenge to us. Our culture tells us what? Your goal in life is to accumulate as much as you can, to invest so that when you do retire, you can spend your days pursuing your leisure, hobbies, travel, leisure, whatever it is. You've deserved it. And I don't like to use it as an example, but I know one couple in particular who served very, very hard in the church, and I don't doubt their salvation, but the only thing you ever hear from them these days are pictures of their cruises, and they're running around the world half the year. Abraham shows us a different way. Even in his old age, he remained steadfastly committed to God's purposes. He made wise decisions about his resources. He continued to live as a sojourner, never forgetting that this world was his home. Think of it. 175 years old, still living in a tent, and he's got all the money in the world to be able to put down roots and have all the luxuries he wanted. I wonder how many of us are so busy building our lives that we forget we're just passing through. How many of us are investing in a world and forgetting that it's temporary, that we should be investing in the eternal? Cancer is a dreaded word. And we have some very dear family members in this congregation struggling with it right now. And if you were to ask one of them, what have you learned because of this or from this? I'm sure one of the top lessons would be, I'm just passing through. I'm looking forward to the day when I'm united with my Savior. Oh, yeah, I love my family more. I love the grandkids. I'll hug them. I appreciate more every breath. This fall, I'm going to smell the decay of the leaves and that unique smell that comes up from the forest floor. I'm going to enjoy every sunrise and every sunset. I'm going to enjoy every opportunity I can to come to church and to worship with God's people. But I'm also a pilgrim. My citizenship is in another place, and soon I'm going to be there. Abraham owned a burial plot in the promised land, and that was it. And Hebrews 11, verse 10 says, he was looking forward to the place, or to the city, that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He fixed his eyes not on what he could accumulate here, but on God's eternal purposes. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the blessings that we have that come from God. Again, Abraham was a very wealthy man. But it does mean that we have to hold them with an open hand. We don't clutch them and say that they're ours. It means that we use our resources, our time, our energy, not primarily for building us up, but for building up the kingdom of God. And maybe you're thinking to yourself this morning, well, I don't have an incurable disease. I'm not old. I'm only in my 20s, early 30s. Life is ahead of me. I've got everything to look forward to. Do you? Do you know how many days God has allotted you on this earth? Do you know how many breaths you have until you breathe your last? Abraham's example shows us how to finish well spiritually. How to face our mortality, no matter what our age, young or old, how to put our affairs in order, how to leave a legacy of faith to those behind us. Abraham died full of years, not because he had accumulated enough experiences or enough possessions, but because he had fulfilled the purposes of God for him, and he could be content. And that's what makes a life truly worth living. Abraham lived to 175 before he left. As Abraham neared the end of his life, I'm sure, again, there was lots of time to reflection. That getting older, that's just what it does. He could think about his walk with God. There were times, I'm sure, that he was sitting there, maybe sipping on a little goat's milk, and he was thinking, oh, that was such a horrible thing I did. He winced as he remembered how he betrayed the Lord's trust. How he had failed to depend upon him fully. Oh, the silliness. Why did I pass Sarah off as only my sister? Not just once, but twice. That was so stupid. But there were also times when he had a deep sense of gratitude and worship that I'm sure welled up in him as he remembered those important times as well. Standing out at night under the stars, overwhelmed by the sheer number, and hearing God say, if you can count them, you can also count your offspring. Or the joy that just must have overwhelmed him when he heard the bleating of a ram behind him as he has his hand with a dagger raised above the breast of Isaac. Living a life of faith and faithfulness to God had not been easy, even for Abraham. When he first heard God's call on Ur, 100 years before that. He was eager to leave, probably naive and probably a little bit nervous, but he obeyed. He followed God. Since then, there had been times when God was silent, even for years. There were tests and trials. There were times of sin. But through it all, God had remained faithful to his promises and to Abraham. And because of that, Abraham's faith had grown. It had matured. It had become resilient. And so now in the end time, at the last days, it is flourishing. He's now able to look at all the things, the good, the bad, the ugly, and be struck by God's undeserved mercy in his life. And to experience what I'm sure was a continual deep sense of contentment and joy. 100 years of walking with the Lord, perhaps the greatest lesson he ever learned was endurance. Persevering in faith despite the circumstances, despite what the world indicated around him. Never forsaking the promises of God. Never giving up on God's provision. Never settling down. Always on the move and always waiting for God to reveal a city who's made not with human hands, but with divine hands. So, chapter 25, Abraham isn't simply an example of faith. He's an example of faith that rests in God's faithfulness to the end. And then turn with me to Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. I should have that on a slide. Remember, this is the great summation of what we should learn coming out of looking at all the people who were faithful before us, including Abraham. Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. We may not like to think about it, but it's much easier than we think to live a life of faith and yet in our final days not knowing the fullness of God's blessings. How many Christian leaders over the years have fallen from grace? How many of your friends have deconstructed their testimony and now reject their faith? It's as easy as not laying aside my desire to satisfy my lusts and my sin, of wasting my time on things that do not glorify God and do not build me up. It's as easy as neglecting the things of God that are designed to actually do just that, to build me up, to make me a stronger Christian. Things like His Word, things like prayer, things like worship and coming to church. And maybe you're sitting here this morning and you're thinking, yeah, well, my faith is a little wobbly. It's a little frail. But there's really nothing wrong with that. I don't see any consequences. But you know what? That frailty, that tipsiness right now, left on its own, will become your stumbling block. If anyone in the Old Testament learned endurance because of their faith, surely it was Abraham. He's the father of faith. No one had worked this out firsthand before. He was the first one. And right now, according to Hebrews 12, he is here amongst us. One of those witnesses this morning. His life testifies that it is possible and should be our desire to live by faith from beginning to end. It is possible and should be our desire to trust the promises of God even when we never see them completed in this life. It's possible to know that the end of our days come and have a deep contentment and love for God, that He has been so gracious to us. And ultimately, Abraham points us to Jesus. Abraham had faith, but Jesus is the founder and the perfecter of our faith, isn't he? Abraham died in faith without receiving all of the promises of God. But Jesus completed his work. He died on the cross. He rose again and is now seated at the right hand of God. So what does it mean to live a blessed life in a covenant with God? It means fixing our eyes on Jesus. It means holding loosely to the things of this world. It means remaining committed to God's purposes to our very last breath. It means leaving a legacy of faith to influence the generations that come behind us. So whether you're in the prime of your life, whether you're a little older, whether you're facing illness, whether you're still very young, the call is still the same. We must run with endurance. We must run the race that is set before us. We can't get distracted by what the culture says will fulfill us. We look to Jesus. We trust His promises. We live as a sojourner, yearning for the day when He comes, we will be with Him again. Then, like Abraham, when our time comes, and it will come, each and every one of us, we will die full of years. Not because of how you lived, but because of how well you lived in covenant with God. The average person breathes 15 to 20 minutes, or breathes 15 to 20 times a minute. And if you take an average healthy person around 80 years old, breathing, let's say 16 times a minute, that person will actually take 672 million breaths, approximately. 672 million breaths. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But it's always ticking down. Even as we've been in this sanctuary for the past hour, you've taken about 960 breaths. By the end of the day, you'll have taken 23,000 breaths. And it keeps counting down. At some point, unbeknownst to you, you will have only 1,000 breaths left. Then it'll be 100. Then it'll be 10. 5 breaths. 4 breaths. 3 breaths. 2 breaths. When he finished his last breath, Abraham experienced peace and fullness with God. And it was because his faith endured to the last. I pray that that is your desire. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you